What if the Jesus you carry in your imagination isn't the Jesus the Bible actually reveals? For many of us, the image of Jesus has been shaped by paintings, stained glass, or cultural tradition. We picture him as someone majestic, glowing, and instantly recognizable. But Scripture tells us a story that is both more ordinary and far more extraordinary than anything we expect. And once you see these truths, you can never look at him the same way again. This video will uncover 30 powerful facts about Jesus, details we've read 100 times, but never truly seen. Some are surprising moments from his life. Others are breathtaking revelations about his death and resurrection. A few are familiar stories, but with dimensions we often miss. And the first 10, they are among the most shocking. You'll hear how the resurrection of Jesus was not a ghostly idea, but something physical, something you could touch. You'll discover why Judas had to kiss him so soldiers would even recognize who he was. You'll see how his very first miracle wasn't about raising the dead, but about rescuing a wedding party from shame. But we're not stopping there. Later in this video, we'll journey to the Garden of Gethsemane, where the pressure of his mission pressed him so hard that his sweat fell like drops of blood. We'll look at the cross, where the prophet Isaiah's words came true. His appearance was marred beyond recognition, so disfigured that people hardly saw a man. We'll stand with his mother Mary, present at both his birth and his death, a sword piercing her soul, just as Simeon had foretold decades earlier. And before we finish, we'll hear the voice of God the Father, echoing 3 times in the New Testament to declare who his Son truly was. Every fact builds to something greater. These are not random trivia notes about the life of Jesus. Each one reveals a side of his mission and character, his humility, his compassion, his fulfillment of prophecy, his suffering, and ultimately his glory. And as we move closer to the final chapters, we'll see how all of it flows into the Great Commission, the moment when Jesus turned to his followers and to us and said, "Go into all the world and make disciples." So if you think you already know Jesus, stay with me. What you're about to hear may challenge your assumptions. Some of it may even feel uncomfortable, but all of it will bring you closer to the living Christ. By the end, you won't just know more facts about Jesus. You'll see how every detail of his life points to one breathtaking truth. He is Emmanuel, God with us, from his birth in Bethlehem to his suffering at the cross, to his resurrection in glory. And his story isn't finished yet, because it continues in you. Are you ready? Then let's begin. The resurrection is the cornerstone of Christianity. Without it, our faith is empty. But here's what makes it even more extraordinary. It wasn't a ghostly vision or a spiritual symbol. It was physical, flesh and bone reality. In Luke chapter 24, verse 39, Jesus stands among his disciples and says, "Touch me and see. A spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." He didn't rise as a mist or a phantom. He rose in the very body that had been nailed to the cross. And to drive the point home, he asked for food. They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it in their presence. Think about that. The one who had conquered death chewing food, his body alive, tangible, unshakable. Why does this matter? Because it means our own hope of resurrection is not vague or imaginary. It's real. Jesus rose in a body, and so will those who belong to him. Christianity doesn't end with a ghost floating into the clouds. It ends with renewed creation, a physical eternity. This may shock you. Jesus wasn't physically striking. He didn't walk around glowing with beauty. The prophet Isaiah said in chapter 53, verse 2, "He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him." So ordinary was his appearance that Judas needed to point him out with a kiss in order for soldiers to know who to arrest. And even after his resurrection, Mary Magdalene mistook him for a gardener until he spoke her name. Why? Because God didn't want people to follow Jesus because of how he looked, but because of who he was. His power came not from outward appearance, but from the Spirit within him. This is a challenge to us too. How often do we judge by appearances when God looks at the heart? When we think of miracles, we often picture dramatic moments: the blind seeing, the storm stilled, the dead raised. Yet Jesus' very first miracle was something different. At a wedding in Cana, he turned water into wine. Why? Because the family had run out, and in that culture it was a deep shame to fail your guests. Jesus chose as his first public sign not a grand display of cosmic power, but an act of compassion that preserved a family's joy. He filled 6 stone jars with water, and it became the best wine anyone had ever tasted. This was more than hospitality. It was a sign. Water turned into wine pointed to ordinary life being transformed by his presence. When Jesus steps in, shame is lifted, emptiness becomes abundance, and ordinary jars overflow with joy. Few miracles are more breathtaking than this. At least 3 times, Jesus brought someone back to life. First, in Luke chapter 7, he meets a widow in Nain, following the funeral of her only son. Moved with compassion, he tells her not to weep, and then commands the young man to rise. The boy sits up in his coffin and begins to speak. Can you imagine the joy and shock of that moment? Second, in Mark chapter 5, Jairus' daughter had died. When Jesus arrives, the house is full of mourners. He takes the girl by the hand and says, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately she rises. Third, in John chapter 11, Jesus raises Lazarus, who had been dead 4 days. He calls into the tomb, "Lazarus, come out," and Lazarus emerges, alive. Every one of these miracles pointed to the greatest resurrection still to come, his own, and they remind us that he holds power not only over sickness, but over death itself. The Gospels record many miracles of Jesus, but only one, aside from his resurrection, appears in all 4. The feeding of the 5,000, 5 loaves, 2 fish, thousands of hungry people. And Jesus takes what seems impossibly small, blesses it, and multiplies it until everyone is satisfied. 12 baskets of leftovers remain. This story is more than food. It's a picture of Jesus himself, the bread of life, who satisfies our deepest hunger. It's a lesson that what seems too little in our hands becomes abundance in his. On the night before his crucifixion, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed with such anguish that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Luke chapter 22, verse 44. Doctors call this condition hematidrosis, rare but possible under extreme stress. What's stunning is that only Luke, the physician, records it. Jesus' agony wasn't only physical. It was the crushing weight of sin, separation from the Father, the burden of the cross. In that moment, he shows us what it looks like to surrender fully. Not my will, but yours be done. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14 prophesied it. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. The beatings, the scourging, the crown of thorns, they left him so broken that he barely looked human. This is how far he went to bear our sin. The cross is not sanitized. It was brutal, but in that brokenness, his glory shines brighter than ever. The suffering servant became the conquering king. From cradle to cross, Mary was there. She held him as a newborn in Bethlehem, and decades later she stood at the foot of the cross. Simeon had told her in Luke chapter 2, verse 35, "A sword will pierce your own soul too." And it came true. Watching her son die, the deepest pain pierced her heart. Yet even in that agony, Jesus looked down and cared for her. In John chapter 19, verse 26 to 27, he said to the disciple John, "Here is your mother." This is more than history. It's a glimpse of his heart. Even in death, he provided for his mother. In Mark chapter 1, verse 41, a man with leprosy fell on his knees before Jesus and begged, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Lepers were untouchable, outcasts forced to live outside the community, but Jesus did something no one expected. He reached out his hand and touched him. Instantly the man was healed. But the miracle wasn't only in the cure, it was in the touch. Jesus could have healed with a word, but he chose to restore dignity first. In that moment, he showed us that God's love is not afraid of our uncleanness. His holiness is greater than our shame. 3 times in the Gospels, the Father's voice broke through. At his baptism, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." At the Transfiguration, "This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him." Before the cross in John chapter 12, "I have glorified it and will glorify it again." The Father publicly affirmed the Son, not once but 3 times, a declaration not only for him but for us, so that we would know who he truly is. And these are just the first 10. Each one pulls us deeper into the reality of who Jesus is, his power, his suffering, his compassion, his glory. But there's more. His story doesn't only shine in miracles and suffering, it also lives in his hidden years, his family, and the surprising details of his early life. That's where we're headed next. Many great teachers and religious leaders left behind writings. Moses recorded the law, David poured his heart into the Psalms, the prophets filled scrolls with their visions. But Jesus, he never wrote a book, not even a letter, and yet his words have shaped history more than any library combined. Why didn't he write? We can't know fully, but perhaps because his life was the message. His actions were his book. When he healed the blind, it was a living chapter. When he forgave sins, it was a sermon written in flesh and blood. And when he died and rose again, it was the greatest declaration the world has ever read. Most parents agonize over choosing a name, but Mary didn't. In Luke chapter 1, verse 31, the angel told her, "You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus." The name was chosen by God himself. In Hebrew, Yeshua means "the Lord saves." Before he spoke a single word, before he performed a single miracle, his very identity declared his mission, salvation. His name wasn't simply a label, it was his destiny. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and in Hebrew that name means house of bread. Centuries earlier, the prophet Micah had foretold, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come, for me, one who will be ruler over Israel." Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Jesus later declared in John chapter 6, verse 35, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Bread that sustains, bread that satisfies, bread that never runs out, born in the very town named after it." The detail is too precise to be coincidence. It was prophecy fulfilled. The Gospels give us only one glimpse into Jesus' childhood, and it's remarkable. At 12 years old, his parents lost him on the way back from Jerusalem. After 3 days of searching, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening and asking questions. Luke chapter 2, verse 47 says, Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. Even as a boy, his wisdom baffled scholars. But when Mary scolded him, he gently answered, "Did you not know I must be in my Father's house?" At 12, he already understood his divine mission. Mark chapter 6 verse 3 records people saying, "Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son?" For years before he ever preached or healed, Jesus worked with his hands. The word used for carpenter can mean builder, someone who worked with wood and stone. He was no stranger to labor. He likely built doors, plows, maybe even homes. The creator of the universe lived as a craftsman, showing us that there is dignity in ordinary work. Before he ever carried a cross, he carried tools. In first-century Palestine, Aramaic was the common tongue. Like all Jewish boys, he learned the scriptures in Hebrew, and in his interactions with Roman officials, he likely used Greek. Why does this matter? Because even in his speech, Jesus bridged worlds. He could speak to villagers in Galilee, debate with scholars in the temple, and converse with Gentiles under Roman rule. His very voice was a foreshadowing of the gospel's reach, from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. The Gospels mention that Jesus had brothers named James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, and also sisters. Matthew chapter 13, verses 55 to 56. But during his ministry, they did not believe in him. John chapter 7, verse 5 says plainly, "Even his own brothers did not believe in him." It was only after the resurrection that his brothers came to faith. James became a leader of the church in Jerusalem and wrote the book of James. Jude wrote the short but powerful letter near the end of the New Testament. This is significant. The people who grew up with him, who once doubted him, were later willing to die for the truth that he is Lord. From hidden years in a carpenter's home to a name given by an angel, from brothers who once doubted to a hometown that saw him as ordinary, all of these early details point to something greater. Jesus lived quietly, yet prophecy and purpose surrounded him from the start. But once he stepped into his ministry, everything changed. And that's where we go next. His habits of prayer, his passion, his teaching, and the emotions that showed us the heart of God. In John chapter 11, verse 35, we find the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Yet within those two words lies one of the deepest truths about him. Standing at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, knowing he was about to raise him from the dead, Jesus still cried. He entered into the sorrow of the moment. He allowed himself to feel the grief of those around him. This fact reminds us that Jesus was not distant from human pain. He did not walk through life detached, cold, or immune. He allowed tears to run down his face. If the Son of God wept, then our tears are not weakness, they are holy. Jesus was full of love and compassion, but he was not timid. In Mark chapter 11, verses 15 to 17, he entered the temple and found money changers exploiting the poor. He overturned tables, scattered coins, and drove them out with force. His voice thundered, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." This wasn't uncontrolled rage. It was righteous anger. It was the fire of holiness defending the honor of God. In a world that often confuses love with passivity, this moment shows us that true love sometimes fights. Jesus' anger was never selfish. It was always protective, aimed at injustice and hypocrisy. Luke chapter 6 verse 12 tells us, "One of those days Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God." Imagine that. The Son of God, who spoke galaxies into existence, stayed up through the darkness just to talk to his Father. Prayer wasn't a formality for Jesus. It was his lifeline. Before choosing the 12 disciples, before facing the cross, before great decisions or battles, he prayed. Sometimes we think of prayer as a last resort, but for Jesus, it was the first move. His secret place of power was not the crowds or the miracles. It was the quiet of a mountainside where only heaven could hear. Jesus could have spoken with lofty words. He could have delivered his sermons with technical theological terms that only scholars would grasp. But instead, he told stories. He pointed to lilies in the field, birds in the sky, seeds falling on soil, a lamp set on a stand. Why? Because truth wasn't meant to stay locked in books. It was meant to be lived. When he said, "I am the vine, you are the branches." John chapter 15, verse 5. His listeners could see it in the vineyards around them. When he spoke of a shepherd leaving 99 sheep to find the one, everyone understood. His teaching was accessible, memorable, and visual. And that is why his words still resonate with farmers and CEOs alike, with children and professors. In Mark chapter 4, verse 39, the disciples were panicking in a storm. Waves crashed into the boat, the wind howled, and seasoned fishermen feared for their lives. And what did Jesus do? He stood and said, "Quiet, be still." Immediately the storm obeyed. This wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. The sea and the sky recognized the voice that had called them into being at creation. In that moment, his disciples whispered in awe, "Who is this?" Even the wind and the waves obey him. Mark chapter 4, verse 41. Nature itself bows to him. Perhaps the most famous miracle of all is found in Matthew chapter 14, verses 25 to 27. The disciples were straining at the oars when they saw what they thought was a ghost walking across the waves. Terror filled them until a familiar voice broke through. "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Jesus walked where no human can walk, but more than proving his divinity, this miracle carried a message. What drowns others cannot drown him. And when Peter stepped out onto the water, it showed us that with faith, his power can carry us where we should never stand. Matthew chapter 14, verse 21 says, "The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. And what was the supply? 5 loaves and 2 fish. In his hands, scarcity became abundance." This fact is more than a miracle of multiplication. It is a revelation of the kingdom. Where humans see lack, Christ sees provision. Where we say, "There isn't enough," he says, "Give me what you have, and watch." And not only were the crowds fed, there were 12 baskets left over. His provision doesn't just meet the need, it overflows. We often hear of Lazarus, but that wasn't the only time. In Luke chapter 7, verses 11 to 15, Jesus met a funeral procession in the town of Nain. A widow's only son lay lifeless, and her future looked hopeless. Moved with compassion, Jesus stopped the procession, touched the coffin and spoke, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the boy sat up and began to talk. Death retreated at his command. Funerals turned into celebrations. Families were restored. Every resurrection pointed forward to his own, the ultimate victory where death itself would bow before him. In Mark chapter 5, Jesus encountered a man possessed by a legion of demons. Chains couldn't hold him, people avoided him, and he lived among tombs. But when Jesus stepped onto the shore, the demons begged for mercy. They knew his authority. This fact shatters the illusion that darkness and light are equals locked in a struggle. They are not equals. Jesus doesn't negotiate with evil. He commands, and it flees. His word carries power over every spiritual force, reminding us that in him no chain is unbreakable. The symbol of friendship, a kiss, became the mark of betrayal. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 48, Judas told the soldiers, "The one I kiss is the man, arrest him." Under the cover of night, in the quiet of Gethsemane, the Son of God was sold out not with a sword, but with an embrace. This fact pierces the soul. Sin often disguises itself in gestures of love. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with a dagger. Sometimes it wears the mask of affection. And yet in this darkest moment, Jesus addressed Judas not as an enemy, but with the word friend. Even betrayal couldn't strip away his mercy. The trial of Jesus broke every standard of justice. Jewish law forbade trials at night, yet his took place in the dark hours before dawn. Witnesses contradicted one another, but the leaders pressed on. Pilate himself admitted, "I find no basis for a charge against him." John chapter 18, verse 38. This fact reveals the paradox of history's greatest injustice. The only truly innocent man was condemned as guilty so that the guilty might go free. What appeared to be the failure of justice was, in God's plan, the fulfillment of redemption. John chapter 19, verse 17 tells us, "Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull. The instrument of shame was laid on his torn back, and he staggered beneath its weight. Along the way, Simon of Cyrene was pulled from the crowd to help, but not before Jesus bore it himself. This fact is a window into the depth of his love. Every step he took was for us. Every drop of blood marked the road of redemption. And when he said in Luke chapter 9, verse 23, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must take up their cross daily and follow me," it wasn't a metaphor pulled from thin air. It was the path he walked first. As the nails held him, as the crowd mocked him, as soldiers gambled for his clothing, Jesus lifted his voice, not in curses, but in mercy. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke chapter 23, verse 34. This fact defies logic. How could the innocent extend grace to those who murdered him? Yet this is the heart of the gospel, forgiveness offered to the unworthy. His final hours weren't filled with bitterness, but with love so radical that it still shakes the world today. From betrayal to forgiveness, the cross wasn't just an event. It was a revolution of love. A king who conquered not by killing his enemies, but by dying for them. What have we uncovered together? 30 unforgettable facts about Jesus, some familiar, others hidden in plain sight, but all pointing to the same truth. He is no ordinary man. He is the Son of God, the Savior of the world, the one who rewrote history with his life, his death, and his resurrection. We've seen him mocked and misunderstood, yet forgiving. We've seen him touch lepers no one else dared approach, and silence storms with a word. We've seen him reveal his glory on a mountaintop, only to descend into the valley of suffering and carry a cross meant for us. Every fact tells a part of the greater story. The story of a God who didn't stay distant, but stepped into time, walked dusty roads, wept with the grieving, and ate with sinners. A God who allowed himself to be betrayed by a kiss, condemned in a sham trial, and nailed to a cross. And yet, who from that cross spoke words of love. "Father, forgive them." But here's the heart of it. These aren't just historical details. They are living truths. Jesus wasn't resurrected only to prove a point. He rose to prove a promise. The scars on his hands still cry out that redemption is real. His ordinary appearance reminds us that God often comes in ways we least expect. His authority over nature and demons shows that no chaos in our lives is beyond his reach. His forgiveness from the cross means no sin is too great to be washed clean. And if all this is true, then we cannot remain neutral. The facts demand a response. The cross still stands before you, the tomb is still empty, and the voice of Christ still calls your name. Will you turn away, or will you follow him? Will you stay in the crowd, watching from a distance, or will you take up your cross and walk in his footsteps? This is more than knowledge. It is an invitation to see Jesus not just as a figure of history, but as the living Christ who still calls, still heals, still forgives. The one who knows your wounds, your doubts, your fears, and yet calls you friend. And now, the choice is in your hands. These 30 facts are not just a journey through Scripture, they are a doorway into eternity. The question is no longer simply, do you believe these truths? The real question is, what will you do with Jesus? If this message has touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs hope today. And tell me in the comments, which of these 30 truths about Jesus impacted you most deeply? Your story may be the spark that ignites faith in someone else. Because the greatest fact of all is not just that Jesus lived, died, and rose again. The greatest fact is that he is alive right now, and he is calling you by name.